This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More about them later. In the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi troops crossed the border into Kuwait. Saddam believed he was too important to U.S. foreign policy to be removed from power, and his conspiratorial mindset led him to believe that the U.S. was well aware of his ambitions, hence their lack of more forceful action. The main problem was that the Bush administration remained committed to improving relations with Baghdad, hoping against hope. In pursuit of this policy, President Reagan and Bush pulled their punches when Saddam gassed his enemies. Saddam saw what he could get away with, and this surely influenced his calculations about Kuwait. Saddam tended to think that the CIA was omniscient, that it knew Iraq's important secrets. Surely, therefore, the U.S. knew about his clandestine plan to occupy Kuwait. The administration only realized this the morning of August 1st, when CIA satellites picked up large movements of troops, and even then they didn't think Saddam would take all of Kuwait. An upstart dictator with delusions of grandeur was the last thing President Bush wanted to deal with. The Berlin Wall had just fallen 9 months earlier. Eastern Europe was in the throes of revolution, all the while the administration was trying to get the START Treaty signed and ratified in both the USSR and the Senate. And that's not including all the domestic issues he has to deal with. Despite all of this, he still needed to do something. If you want the full context, then make sure you watch this previous video. But in this video, we're going to look at how the world responded to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The U.S. National Security Council met at 11 p.m. DC time on August 1st, and didn't adjourn until 2 a.m. the next day. They debated what short notice options they had, such as freezing both Iraqi and Kuwaiti assets, which the UK would also do shortly after. Although most of the attendees were open to doing something, some weren't entirely convinced Iraq annexing a small neighboring country was detrimental to U.S. interests. Colin Powell, always more politically minded, brought up concerns about polling numbers and public support, linking the concerns to his experience in the Vietnam War. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney was mostly concerned about the invasion's impact on the global economy, with Saddam controlling nearly 50% of the world's known oil reserves. But just as the NSC was adjourning, the United Nations Security Council met in New York. At the time, Secretary of State James Baker was meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze in Siberia, so the ambassador to the UN, Thomas Pickering, was charged with getting a resolution passed. They would draft a clear and concise resolution condemning the invasion. The Security Council, alarmed by the invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990 by the military forces of Iraq, determining that there exists a breach of international peace and security as regards the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, acting under Articles 39 and 40 of the Charter of the United Nations, 1. Condemns the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, 2. Demands that Iraq withdraw immediately and unconditionally all its forces to the positions in which they were located on August 1, 1990, 3. Calls upon Iraq and Kuwait to begin immediately intensive negotiations for the resolution of their differences and supports all efforts in this regard, and especially those of the League of Arab States, 4. Decides to meet again as necessary to consider further steps to ensure compliance with the present resolution. 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council voted in favor of this measure, with the representative of Yemen neither voting nor abstaining. The UN's General Secretary, Javier Perez de Cuellar, would go on to, if not blame the US and Soviet Union for the attack, then to at least blame them for preventing earlier UN intervention. I could have gone to the Security Council. The Council would likely have issued a warning statement and possibly sent a fact-finding mission to the area. I believe this would have had a restraining influence on Saddam Hussein. He claims that the US and USSR not sharing intelligence gathered by their satellites with the Security Council prevented the UN from sending a fact-finding mission to Iraq, which he thinks would have delayed or prevented the invasion. However, this assertion is based on a conversation he had days before Desert Storm began, where Saddam complained that the sanctions and military force were approved of before the UN even had the facts. Of course, this was most likely just Saddam passing the blame for the invasion to someone else, and it's in the General Secretary's interest to assert that their role is more important than it actually is. Regardless, they had an invasion to deal with. About 100,000 Iraqi troops had crossed the border, along with 300 tanks. Saddam had also sent in helicopters to deploy special forces, but they were ill-equipped, without night vision, and had little experience flying at night. In order to avoid getting lost and evade anti-aircraft radars, they flew close to the ground, which caused sand to be blown into the air, obscuring the pilots' visions, resulting in numerous helicopters crashing into each other, as well as accidentally hitting power lines along the Baghdad-Kuwait highway, knocking out electricity in parts of the country. By 9 a.m. Baghdad time, the Iraqis had destroyed Kuwaiti command centers and defeated Kuwait's 16,000-strong army with little resistance. Most of the Kuwaiti Air Force, along with the government and about 300,000 citizens, had fled the country, with only the emir's brother remaining behind, who would be killed by Saddam's Republican Guard on the steps of the palace. When asked to justify the invasion later that day, Saddam claimed that they had intervened in support of an anti-monarchist coup that allegedly happened the night before. The Iraqi Baathists had a history of portraying all of their acts as continuations of the 1958 coup that deposed the pro-British Hashemite dynasty, like they had done with their own coup in 1968. They set up a puppet regime called the Provisional Revolutionary Government, and implied that they were going to withdraw within a few days once they put down the monarchist insurgents. But nobody believed these promises, with the U.S. reporting that Iraqi forces were digging in and fortifying their positions near the border with Saudi Arabia. Western analysts feared the impacts of a long occupation by Iraqi forces. The longer they stayed, the more difficult it would be to drive them out. Needless to say, most world leaders did not believe Saddam or his government. The NSC met again at 8 a.m., with General Norman Schwarzkopf of Central Command explaining the current state on the ground, as well as potential forms of retaliation with the resources they had in the region, which were scant. Secretary Cheney discussed the potential economic impacts again, and from the beginning was advocating a military solution to the crisis. The National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, pushed for an economic embargo of Iraq, cutting off the flow of oil from Iraq and Kuwait, while asking the rest of OPEC to increase oil production to make up for the decline in supply. President Bush would order Tom Pickering to get a Security Council resolution on it passed, while also asking Congress to pass a unilateral embargo. When the president asked about other military options, Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell told him that they would need significantly more forces in the region to do anything more than limited airstrikes. However, Powell advised President Bush to establish a red line at the Saudi border, which the president agreed to. This fits within everyone's presumptions. Defending Saudi Arabia was within U.S. interests, but nobody there believed the president would be willing to send American soldiers to die for Kuwait. Although the invasion of Kuwait was barely 14 hours old, it was clear that President Bush had already determined that Saddam's aggression had to be checked. He instructed us to be prepared to fight if Iraq took the American embassy staff hostage. The State Department would consider sending an evacuation order to all American citizens in Iraq and Kuwait, along with formally cutting off diplomatic ties. The president would order an aircraft carrier from the Indian Ocean Fleet to the Gulf, while the Defense and State Departments began seeking permission from the Saudis to deploy a squadron of F-15s to deter further aggression from Saddam. Cheney and Powell would meet with the Saudi ambassador, Prince Bandar, telling him that the U.S. was prepared to send 200,000 soldiers to Saudi Arabia. Despite all of these developments, the Arab states were telling Bush to use restraint, hoping to reach an Arab solution to the crisis. The truth is, at the moment I had no idea what our options were. I did know for sure that the aggression had to be stopped, and Kuwait sovereignty restored. After the NSC meeting, Bush boarded a flight for a pre-planned trip to Colorado to meet with Margaret Thatcher, both of whom were scheduled to give speeches at the Aspen Institute Symposium. The president gave a speech based on plans drafted by Colin Powell, which in his words would mark the end of the Cold War strategy of containment, calling for a reduction in enlistments by 500,000. Thatcher had arrived in Aspen the day before, while Iraqi troops were building up on the border, and the next morning she approved the deployment of the HMS York, Penang, and Mombasa to the Gulf. Despite these speeches being in the works for months, they would be overshadowed by the ongoing crisis in Kuwait. Bush and Thatcher met after the symposium, with the invasion the primary topic of discussion, sharing the intelligence each had access to. Thatcher was adamantly opposed to appeasing Saddam, calling on both her personal experience in dealing with Argentina in 1982, as well as alluding to Neville Chamberlain's policies toward Hitler. With the UK more dependent on the Middle East for oil, she feared giving Saddam control of 2/3 of the world's known reserves. President Bush was more reluctant to use force, with the ghosts of Vietnam still lingering in the background, which Thatcher feared might lead him to appeasing Saddam with Saudi territory. Although I am a strong believer in international law, I did not like unnecessary resort to the UN, because it suggested that sovereign states lacked the moral authority to act on their own behalf. If it became accepted that force could not be used, even in self-defense, when the United Nations approved, neither Britain's interests nor those of international justice and order would be served. If Iraq wins, no small state is safe. This is no time to go wobbly, George. This was the fear and power of modern warfare, which you can simulate in this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is a comprehensive vehicle combat game with over 2,500 tanks, planes, and ships from 10 major countries across a century of history. with over 70 million players worldwide, whom you can challenge to PvP battles with countless hours of content to uncover, and it's available on both PC and consoles for free. You can immerse yourself in realistic combat using detailed weapons with authentic sound effects that place you in the middle of the story, piloting the most powerful machines of modern warfare. And these weapons are full of specs you'd be expected to check if you were in real combat, making this game more than just mouse-clicking hitboxes. The game also has X-ray views, showing you what exactly is happening when a target is hit. And the game is crafted to fit whatever playstyle you have, be it fast-paced simplified mechanics, or the more in-depth simulator and realistic modes. There's no game better suited for fans of military history. And as mentioned earlier, all of this is available for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. And right now is a great time to get started or to return if you've been gone for a while. If you sign up using my link in the description or in the pinned comment below, you will get a massive bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles with an exclusive vehicle decorator, along with 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account. But you better act fast because this bonus is only available for a limited time. So what are you waiting for? Sign up using my link below and get access to a great military history experience. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. Although most of the Arab states were nominally opposed to the invasion, some would try to play the mediator between Saddam and the West, namely King Hussein of Jordan, who had called both Bush and Thatcher, begging them to allow the Arabs to resolve the dispute themselves. Brent Scowcroft was in agreement with Thatcher's concerns of appeasement, and feared leaving the resolution of the crisis to the Arabs would result in further Iraqi belligerence. President Bush was afraid of Israel taking unilateral action against Saddam as they had back in 1981, especially because the Israelis were the only country in the region that believed Saddam's actions were more than just saber-rattling. After their meeting, the two would issue a joint condemnation of the invasion.
Iraq has violated and taken over the territory of a country which is a full member of the United Nations. That is totally unacceptable. And if it were allowed to endure, then there would be many other small countries that could never feel safe. The fundamental question is this: whether the nations of the world have the collective will effectively to see that Security Council resolution is upheld, whether they have the collective will effectively to do anything which the Security Council further agrees to see that Iraq withdraws and that the government of Kuwait is restored to Kuwait. None of us can do it separately. We need a collective and effective will of the nations belonging to the United Nations.
Prime Minister Thatcher and I are looking at it on exactly the same wavelength, concerned about this naked aggression, condemning it, and hoping that a peaceful solution will be found that will result in the restoration of the Kuwaiti leaders to their rightful place, and prior to that, a withdrawal of Iraqi forces.
After the press conference, President Bush would receive a call from King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who had talked to Saddam earlier that day and couldn't convince him to withdraw. King Fahd informed Bush that most of the Kuwaiti government and royal family were now in Saudi Arabia, filling up hotels and guest palaces. The president offered to send a squadron of F-15s, but King Fahd was hesitant, which made Bush fear that the Saudis were also considering appeasement. But King Fahd would go further rhetorically than the president had anticipated. He is conceited. He doesn't realize that the implications of his actions are upsetting the world order. He seems to think only of himself. He is following Hitler and creating world problems, with a difference. One was conceited, and one is both conceited and crazy. I believe nothing will work with Saddam but the use of force. He is a liar. Saddam must be taught a lesson he will not forget the rest of his life, if he remains alive. Throughout this and future conflicts with Saddam's Iraq, comparisons to Adolf Hitler in World War II would become widespread. This was especially the case for President Bush himself. Many criticize this as a rhetorical trap in order to force people into supporting the war. I mean, after all, what does it say about you if you say no to trying to stop the next Hitler? But despite all these criticisms, I think we should probably take a moment to consider that these were the actual, genuine feelings of President Bush and his administration. First of all, it's worth reminding people that President Bush was a veteran of World War II, serving as a naval aviator in the Pacific Theater. Most of the men of his generation had a habit of comparing every conflict to World War II because that was their personal experience. On top of that, President Bush's thoughts were also being influenced by Martin Gilbert's 1989 book, The Second World War, A Complete History. And throughout his own memoir, President Bush makes frequent comparisons between Hitler and Hussein and between the atrocities in Poland and the atrocities in Kuwait. But he wouldn't be the only ones to analogize this conflict to World War II and Hitler. In a New York Times article, William Safire would write, "If anyone wondered whether this analogy of Saddam Hussein to a predecessor aggressor and mass murderer Adolf Hitler might be an exaggeration, all doubt was removed yesterday. If we negotiated with the kidnapper, we would save the lives of these children, at the cost of tens of thousands, perhaps millions of other children sure to be incinerated when Saddam acquires nuclear bombs. President Bush's choice is Hobson's choice. That is, no choice at all." Abe Rosenthal would take these concerns a step further, not just utilizing Saddam's warlike nature, but also drawing on Hussein and Hitler's shared antipathy for the Jews, raising concerns for the state of Israel. If he wins, he will turn the attack against Israel. He will lead the final holy war as the one true Muslim conqueror, crying destruction to the Jews and death to all Arabs who question his vision, course, and glory. We can all see now the only puzzle about Saddam Hussein's conquest of Kuwait is why the world refused to see it coming. Even that is no vast mystery. The West and the Soviet Union helped create this man of evil dreams. They simply refused to believe he would turn against them, not after they had supplied him with the weapons and loans and all. Left-leaning journalists and pundits were frequently critical of this comparison to Hitler and the Nazis, but they weren't the only ones. Lest you think division over foreign policy is a modern ailment to the GOP or the American right, it was present back in the 90s as well. One of the leading critics was Patrick Buchanan, a former speechwriter for President Nixon and White House communications director under Reagan. He would also criticize this tendency to compare every conflict to World War II and every foreign dictator to Hitler. Buchanan was one of the paleoconservatives who rebranded their isolationism as non-interventionism, and in his 2008 book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, goes on to criticize the neoconservative urge to repeat World War II triumphalism, which he refers to as the cult of Churchill, the urge to liberate a foreign peoples from a dictator and be praised by them in the streets. And although this idea was less refined back in 1990, it was still there, and he argued that it was a serious dividing point on the right. The Gulf crisis has brought to the surface of our politics a deep fissure on the right. On one side, the old right, the traditionalists who seized the GOP away from the Rockefeller Eastern establishment for Barry Goldwater in 1964 and went on to nominate Ronald Reagan in 1980. On the other, the neoconservatives, ex-liberal Democrats who got their baptismal certificates at the Reagan Transition Office. And if you'll allow me a quick tangent, I find this rewriting of the history of the American right to be kinda funny. If you know anything about it, you'll know that the Venn diagram between the Goldwaterites and neoconservatives is a nearly perfect circle. The idea that the guy who wanted to use nukes in Vietnam was aligned with isolationists on foreign policy is laughable. In the early years, Buchanan was against the Reagan administration and its foreign policy, and it's only after he was brought into the White House that he changed his tune somewhat. And since Reagan was the most popular Republican and conservative in the country, Buchanan was trying to rewrite the history of the paleocons in order to incorporate this very popular figure into his movement so that he could claim to be Reagan's rightful successor. Anyways, with that tangent out of the way, let's get back to the story. During the invasion, Secretary of State James Baker was in Siberia meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze on a tour of the Soviet Far East, and thus couldn't be there for either the NSC meetings or the Security Council resolutions. During the Irkutsk meeting, we spoke in a theoretical way about the end of the Cold War, and the improvement of relations between the USSR and the United States could create a certain vacuum in various regions of the world, especially during the early stage, and that crises spawned by regional hegemonic tendencies could fill it. The two were in a meeting when one of Baker's assistants handed him a note, with both learning about it at the same time. The Soviets, who had also been following Saddam's troop buildup via satellites prior to August 2nd, had been under the same impression as the Arab leaders, believing that Saddam was just trying to strong-arm the Kuwaitis into forgiving Iraqi debts. But on August 3rd, he and Shevardnadze signed a joint statement on the Gulf crisis, condemning the invasion, after which Baker would ask the Soviets to join the U.S. in their arms embargo of Iraq. After his return from Aspen, President Bush had more meetings with defense and intelligence officials. CIA Director Bill Webster informed the NSC that Iraqi forces were less than a mile from the border with Saudi Arabia, and that Yemen and Jordan would either support Saddam's efforts or not cooperate with UN boycotts. Deputy Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger suggested they invoke Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which authorized military force and economic sanctions. But Bush wanted to hold off on that, wanting to give Egypt and Saudi Arabia time to get an Arab solution to work. Powell's presentation showed them what units and assets could be sent to the Persian Gulf immediately, emphasizing the need to move quickly, and also brought up the question of whether Kuwait was worth going to war over. Dick Cheney seconded the need for speed, reiterating that the longer the Iraqis were allowed to stay in Kuwait, the harder it would be to expel them militarily. But it's important to plant the American flag in the Saudi desert as soon as possible, assuming we can get there okay. The potential for another hostage crisis was a growing concern as well, with 15 American citizens already having been arrested by the Iraqis. After the meeting, the president would briefly speak with the press about the developments.
The status quo is unacceptable, and further expansion would be even more unacceptable. And there are a lot of options. I'm not going to discuss what they are. We've already taken economic steps, and all options are open, economic and otherwise. Yes?
Mr. President, do you feel your hands are tied until these Arab meetings conclude and they decide what they're going to do?
No, I support the fact that foreign ministers have met in Cairo. I'm very pleased that there's active diplomacy going on in Saudi Arabia. High-level official from Iraq meeting today, as I understand it, with the top officials in Saudi Arabia. All that is good, but my hands aren't tied in terms of having to wait for somebody else in any way. But there's a certain complication to all of this that requires a certain amount of time. It's not an easy matter in any sense, economically, militarily, anything else.
It was 2 days into the crisis, and the Saudis were still reluctant to allow U.S. troops into their country, despite the fact that they were receiving many of the same intelligence reports about Iraqi troops nearing the Saudi border. Various U.S. officials would meet with Ambassador Bandar to get him to convince King Fahd to allow U.S. troops into Saudi Arabia. There were various reasons for Saudi hesitancy, such as the impact thousands of U.S. soldiers might have on Saudi society and politics. But more immediately concerning was the perceived track record of the U.S. in Middle Eastern affairs, as well as their commitment to long-term foreign deployment. There was the U.S. support of Israel, which was incredibly unpopular in the Arab streets. Additionally, when the Shah was deposed in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the U.S. did nothing to restore him to power. Then there was the issue of Vietnam. Not only had the U.S. pulled out before the North was fully dealt with, but when the North finally did attack, the Ford administration broke the promise President Nixon had made to come to Saigon's defense. And this same issue was repeated in Lebanon in 1984. As soon as the occupation got tough, President Reagan pulled the troops out, leaving Amin Gemayel, the Maronites, and Israelis to deal with the Syrians and their proxies alone. Secretary Cheney would meet with Prince Bandar at the Pentagon, where he showed their preliminary plans to deliver 200,000 soldiers to the region, and to emphasize that the U.S. was determined to stay as long as needed, or as long as the Saudis wanted. President Bush would continue his phone diplomacy into the afternoon, speaking with President Francois Mitterrand of France, who preferred to employ economic sanctions rather than military action. He also spoke with President Turgut Özal of Turkey, whom Bush needed to go along with the oil embargo. There were two active pipelines that connected Iraqi oil to the international market. The IPSA, which took oil from Al-Zubair to Al-Mu'ajiz in Saudi Arabia, and the ITCOP, which brought oil from Kirkuk to Ceyhan in Turkey. The Saudis were already planning to shut down the IPSA, and Bush needed Turkey to shut down the ITCOP. Doing this would leave the Gulf as the only major artery for Iraqi oil, which could be policed by the American and Royal Navies. Özal was willing to go along with the embargo, but this had been a major source of revenue for the Turkish government, and he would need some kind of compensation, which was provided by the Gulf states with encouragement from Margaret Thatcher, as well as additional loans from the World Bank arranged by James Baker. Özal also warned Bush that the Jordanians would likely help Saddam evade the sanctions by delivering oil by truck to Jordan, and then exporting it through the port of Aqaba, and that Saddam was planning on annexing Kuwait. But he also claimed that Saddam's military was far more fragile than it appeared, calling it a hollow army. Özal would go a step further, not just advocating his expulsion from Kuwait. Are we going to get rid of Saddam Hussein? We are prevented by law from taking actions to assassinate foreign officials. Our focus now is to strangle him through political and economic sanctions. We need to finish him off. Every state is vulnerable if Saddam Hussein continues to exist. We will be in perpetual danger. Please tell President Bush that he has to go. The NSC met at Camp David on August 4th, where the president hoped to make some important decisions. General Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell present a plan for a troop buildup in Saudi Arabia and an eventual land invasion of Kuwait. But General Schwarzkopf warned that they didn't have enough men or resources in the region to stop Saddam if they decided to invade anytime that month, and that it would take at least 8 months to deliver everything they needed to defend the Saudis and liberate Kuwait. What I've discussed so far is a contingency plan for the defense of Saudi Arabia. If we ever wanted to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, we'd have to go on the offense, and that would take a whole lot more troops and a whole lot more time. By this point, the invasion was 3 days old, and the Saudis were still refusing to permit US troops into the country. And I would like to take a second to talk to you guys about the contingency plan that is my Patreon. Now, this video does have a sponsor, but it is the generous support of my patrons that allows me to weather the algorithm storms between sponsorship deals. And in particular, I would like to thank my latest patrons, Ryan Gard, Abdul Alfazan, and Samabuzi. Patrons get early access to ad and sponsor-free versions of these videos. They also get access to the scripts and notes I use to make these videos and a patrons-only Discord server. And Patreon members also get to vote on future video topics. As of posting this video, there is a post on the Patreon where all the paid members are getting to vote for what video topic I will make when the Patreon finally hits the $500 milestone. And we've got topics such as, were the Nazis socialist? The history of Armenian genocide denial, the Troubles, and a couple others. So if influencing that topic is of interest to you, check it out. But of course, I know the main reason most people support a Patreon isn't for the perks. The perks are mostly a way for us creators to thank you guys for helping us. Most people support a Patreon because they think the videos that person makes are of value and they want to see them make more. And so, deeply and sincerely, I want to thank you guys for this. This has been a rough year so far, and things are just starting to turn around, and you guys over at the Patreon make it a lot better. They'll make it a lot easier. So if you're interested in the Patreon or possibly picking a future video topic, then check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thanks to patrons for supporting this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. By this point, the invasion was 3 days old, and the Saudis were still refusing to permit US troops into the country. Secretary Cheney emphasizes the need to use force to protect Saudi Arabia and to restore the Kuwaiti government. But the president still feared that King Fahd might take the path of least resistance and appease Saddam's ambitions in Kuwait. The US needed a regional base from which to attack Iraq. The Israelis would have been willing to host American forces and allow an attack from their territory, but this would have turned the entire Arab world against the US. Turkey was already an American ally, and it had the infrastructure needed to host the troops, but it was too geographically distanced from Kuwait. There was also the concern that it could drag the rest of NATO into the conflict. They eventually came to a consensus. They would pursue economic sanctions through the UN and allied governments, while building up a ground force in Saudi Arabia to deter an Iraqi attack. All that was left was to convince King Fahd to allow US forces on Saudi soil. President Bush would call King Fahd again, asking him for permission to send troops. But King Fahd wanted to meet with the defense secretary first, but Bush refused to send Cheney to Riyadh unless they already had an agreement to send troops. Brent Scowcroft would meet with Ambassador Bandar, asking him to convince King Fahd to approve troop deployment, and promised a visit from Cheney if he did. After a quick call from Bandar, King Fahd would agree. We will get the team underway. Another point I want to make here involves a world of honor. The security of Saudi Arabia is vital, basically fundamental to US interests, and really to the interests of the Western world. And I am determined that Saddam will not get away with all this infamy. When we work out a plan, once we are there, we will stay until we are asked to leave. You have my solemn word on this. While the US was busy trying to get permission to send troops into the Gulf, the Arab League met in Cairo in order to find a resolution to the crisis before outside intervention was needed. The Bush administration feared that the longer the occupation went on, the more Arab governments would begin complying with Saddam by recognizing the puppet government installed in Kuwait. There was also the fear that Saddam would force a split in the Arab world by launching an attack on Israel. And I think it's important to understand this dichotomy in the Middle East. Their governments aren't perfect reflections of what the people want. Now, this can be said about most countries in general, but this is of a different scale in the Middle East, especially when these regimes are very often unstable. Most governments in the region have refused to grant diplomatic recognition to Israel because they fear societal unrest. Failures in conflicts with the Israelis have triggered numerous coups since 1948. Social and economic reforms have triggered riots and revolutions, some of which successfully toppled centuries-old monarchies. In particular, the cause of the Palestinians is very important to the average Arab on the street, with their governments being far more moderate on the issue. The Arab public hates Israel, and they hate the West, and dictators like Saddam, Assad, and Gaddafi were valorized as resistors of imperialist infidels. But not everyone shares the Western, and especially the European, perception of Saddam Hussein as another Hitler, without Hitler's charm. Nor would such a comparison be seen by all as a wholly negative. In the Middle East, some other perceptions have been expressed. The rulers of Kuwait, and by implication others like them, were Western lackeys, agents of foreign imperialism in Arab lands, and toward the liberation and unification of the Arab world. In this perception, he is the heir of Nasser, of Saladin, and, in his own rhetoric, of Nebuchadnezzar. He will resume and complete the unfinished work of Nasser, and deal with the enemies of the Arabs. Saddam had become very popular amongst the Palestinians for his incessant ravings against the evil Zionists and their masters in Washington. This would lead Yasser Arafat and the PLO to support the invasion. Part of Arafat's reasoning was needing to find another patron for the PLO. The Egyptians had lost their confidence after the Camp David Accords, and he broke ties with Syria when Assad began backing rival Palestinian groups. This left Saddam Hussein, who had been a backer of another rival group, Abu Nidal. Allying with Saddam would create an informal alliance with Abu Nidal and provide them the generous resources of Baghdad. And so, although Saddam had earned the ire of fellow Arab leaders, he was a hero in the Arab streets. After all, who else was standing up to the Americans and the Zionists? The NSC met again on the 5th, receiving additional reports about the movement of Iraqi troops toward the Saudi border, despite the Indian Ocean carrier group dispatched on the 1st still several days away. They also received reports that American and British citizens were being rounded up and sent to Baghdad. In retrospect, if Saddam had wanted to make a go for Saudi Arabia, he probably made a mistake in that he did not do it in this brief window. If he had, he would have had a free run. After the talks with King Fahd, President Bush would debate the necessity of getting a UN authorization with Margaret Thatcher and Brent Scowcroft. Thatcher believed that between the original UN resolution and Article 51 of the UN Charter, they had all the authority they needed to embargo Iraq. Scowcroft, however, feared using the term blockade, which was considered an act of war in international law, to which he suggested they call it a quarantine, citing the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Upon his return to the White House boarding Marine Force One, the president would give a quick response to the journalists waiting for him.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. I've got to go.
Secretary Cheney and General Schwarzkopf visit Saudi Arabia, where they received the formal request to deploy U.S. soldiers to the peninsula, with both parties agreeing to keep the decision silent until the first U.S. forces arrived, fearing Saddam would use the public announcement as an excuse to invade. We are prepared to deploy these forces to defend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. If you ask us, we will come. We will seek no permanent bases, and when you ask us to go home, we will leave. General Schwarzkopf had shown King Fahd satellite photos of the Iraqi army along the border, as well as a few instances of Iraqi tanks actually crossing the border momentarily. After the meeting, Cheney gave Powell the official order to start moving troops. Although this decision was intended to be kept secret, some of the command orders accidentally went out uncoded, and it was only a matter of time before reporters began noticing a lot of movement at U.S. military bases. There were also bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. The early 90s was a transitional period for the American Armed Forces. They were on the verge of a massive decrease in spending as well as a reduction in manpower, which some referred to as the peace dividend. But it was also transitional in terms of operations. At this point, the technology to manage troop deployments and supply requisitions digitally was at the Pentagon's disposal, but they still needed to enter all of the data into the system manually, and doing so properly would take at least a year. But the Pentagon now had a huge order of troops to deploy. If they waited till the data entry process was finished, Saddam might be too entrenched and dug in to expel by force. But if they didn't, they would have to deal with the bureaucratic paperwork by hand. Given these choices, they opted for the latter, making the Gulf War the last pre-computer war, at least in terms of bureaucratic management. The president would meet with numerous leaders at his vacation home in Maine, including Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of Canada, who was a surprising font of intelligence. He told President Bush about a meeting between Hosni Mubarak and Tariq Aziz, who tried to bribe Egypt into supporting the war.
The Iraqi came in and announced that Kuwait has $500 billion that they can put their hands on. They were trying to tell Mubarak that there would be $20 billion for Egypt if Egypt supported Iraq. What clearly happened is that the Iraqis have just robbed the bank and will split it up with whoever will support them.
Prime Minister Mulroney and I have had a very good discussion, talked about bilateral matters, but also, obviously, about the situation regarding Iraq. And Canada, a member of the Security Council, has been not only in a role of leadership there, but side by side with the United States and others. And I told the Prime Minister that I'm very grateful for Canada's position. As we all know, they've contributed to this, I believe it's now 22-nation international force, both on the land and Canada's participation on the sea, ours also, as well as land. And so we're very grateful to them.
Along with all members of the Government of Canada and the people of Canada, we're very pleased with the decision of the United Nations Security Council to provide what I believe is quite unprecedented leadership. Certainly one of the most important days of the United Nations since its foundation have been the series of resolutions in respect of Iraq, where the United Nations, as one, the Security Council, dealt effectively and well with a rogue leader who sought to annex another nation and believed that he could conduct himself with impunity both vis-a-vis his Arab neighbors in the world. And the world turned against him in a quite extraordinary manner. And that is to the credit of the United Nations and those who, pursuant to the lead of the United States under President Bush, of like-minded nations who participated in what we believe is a very important initiative to curb aggression in the Middle East.
Mubarak, who later corroborated the story, believed that Saddam had made the same offer to Jordan, Yemen, and Sudan. Saddam would visit Yemen in the early weeks of the crisis and warn President Saleh that the U.S. would attack both of them with atomic weapons, and that he would respond to the blockades with suicide bombers. August 6th is when the Iraqi hostage crisis began, with Saddam banning foreign nationals from leaving the country, after which he began to take hostages from countries joining Bush's international coalition, including UN staff and officials. Those from the UK and US would be used as human shields, being held at various valuable installations across the country. I remembered all too well the international and domestic perception of the Carter administration during the Tehran hostage crisis. It had appeared that America's hands were tied, and that the attention of its president was controlled by thugs. I was absolutely determined that the American people would be spared this a second time. I wanted them and Saddam Hussein to see not only that the president had the situation under control, but also that he was unworried and confident. If the Iraqis started executing U.S. embassy employees, say, and the president wanted to retaliate, Central Command had little to offer short of a nuclear strike on Baghdad. Back in Baghdad, Saddam meets with Joseph Wilson, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, and asks Wilson for a guarantee that the U.S. won't attack Iraq. He would try to buy off the Americans by promising to provide cheap oil, and promise not to attack Saudi Arabia, but he also threatened to foment popular violence across the Middle East. If what President Bush wants, in fact, is the preservation of U.S. interests as he has described them, then escalation of tension and a military alternative is against these interests. I will tell you how you will be defeated. You are a superpower, and I know you can hurt us, but you will lose the whole area. You will never bring us to our knees. You can destroy some of our economic and industrial base, but the greater damage you cause, the greater the burden to you. In such a situation, we will not remain idle in the region. Convey to President Bush that he should regard the Kuwaiti Emir and Crown Prince as history. We will never leave Kuwait for someone else to take. We would never let Kuwait be an easy bite, even if the whole world were against us. We would fight on. We know you are the superpower who can do great damage to us, but we will never capitulate. But while Saddam was busy trying to carrot and stick the U.S., the Security Council was passing Resolution 661, enacting sanctions, after which both Turkey and Saudi Arabia shut off their oil pipelines from Iraq. On August 8th, President Bush would formally announce the deployment of U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia after the arrival of the 82nd Airborne, at which point he demanded the unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and the restoration of the Kuwaiti monarchy.
In the life of a nation, we're called upon to define who we are and what we believe. Sometimes these choices are not easy. But today, as president, I ask for your support in a decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. At my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland. No one commits America's armed forces to a dangerous mission lightly, but after perhaps unparalleled international consultation and exhausting every alternative, it became necessary to take this action. And let me tell you why. Less than a week ago, in the early morning hours of August 2nd, Iraqi armed forces, without provocation or warning, invaded a peaceful Kuwait. Facing negligible resistance from its much smaller neighbor, Iraq's tanks stormed in blitzkrieg fashion through Kuwait in a few short hours. With more than 100,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and surface-to-surface missiles, Iraq now occupies Kuwait. This aggression came just hours after Saddam Hussein specifically assured numerous countries in the area that there would be no invasion. There is no justification whatsoever for this outrageous and brutal act of aggression. A puppet regime imposed from the outside is unacceptable. The acquisition of territory by force is unacceptable. No one, friend or foe, should doubt our desire for peace, and no one should underestimate our determination to confront aggression.
This was followed by Oman agreeing to support U.S. operations in the region, and the United Arab Emirates agreeing to host U.S. troops as well. The UK, Canada, and Australia would also promise additional naval support in the Gulf. Even the Soviets offered a perfunctory ship for the international flotilla. Everyone wanted some sort of cover to protect themselves against any backlash. Ozal hoped his moves would be cloaked by NATO. Fahd did not wish to be the only Arab state opposing Iraq. Hawke didn't want to be the single Commonwealth country joining the coalition. We needed to demonstrate that this action was not a solo American effort against an Arab state. King Fahd initially approved 100,000 troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia. Both the Soviets and French agreed to an arms embargo against Iraq, and China, still recovering from the backlash of the Tiananmen Square massacre, agreed not to oppose the efforts against Saddam. Secretary Cheney would get permission from Hosni Mubarak to allow nuclear-powered aircraft carriers through the Suez Canal, while also getting both Egypt and Morocco to commit troops to defend Saudi Arabia. But on August 8th, Baghdad announced the annexation of Kuwait, and named Saddam's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, as the governor of the new province. And in case you forgot, al-Majid was the person Saddam put in charge of Kurdistan toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, who orchestrated the Al-Anfal campaign and the genocide of the Kurds. He would begin extracting Kuwaiti wealth, calling for the economic retardation of Kuwait and for the eradication of the Kuwaiti identity. This included removing all references to the royal family from public property and the destruction of all literature referring to Kuwait as an independent country. And this news came out alongside reports of other atrocities. The Arab League held another emergency meeting in Cairo, where 12 of 21 members voted to send a pan-Arab force to Saudi Arabia, with Egyptian and Moroccan troops arriving first. NATO met that same day to condemn Iraq's actions up to that point, and approved individual members of NATO being involved in the coalition. In response to this, Saddam declared a holy war against Israel and the United States, but offered to withdraw from Kuwait if Israel withdrew from Arab territory. Like most Arab despots, Saddam believed that Israel was a puppet of the United States, and that everything it did was either at American behest or was done with Washington's blessings. He would try to reframe his invasion as rectifying a crime of colonialism, placing Kuwait in the same category the Arab world placed the State of Israel. It was at this point the president began sending serious messages to Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, trying to keep the Israelis out of the conflict. As the days went on, the Bush administration feared it was getting harder and harder to actually expel Saddam from Kuwait. The pressure to avoid a ground war was high, with foreign diplomats wanting the sanctions to play out. But the president and his cabinet feared that the amount of time needed for sanctions to work would leave the Iraqi army so entrenched in Kuwait that they couldn't be expelled by force. The Joint Chiefs showed the president how long it would take to get the necessary number of soldiers there to fully defend Saudi Arabia, and then how much longer it would take to get enough to militarily expel Saddam. The U.S. had other military commitments, and it takes weeks or months to go from requisitioning manpower and supplies to actual deployment. Given the slow machinery of bureaucracy, Colin Powell told him that if they were going to go ahead with an assault on Kuwait, they would need to make that decision by mid-October.
Mr. President, is there any hope at all of a diplomatic solution to this crisis?
I don't see it right now, but as the sanctions begin to take effect, it's going to take a while, I would hope there would be a diplomatic solution to this crisis.
Assuming that Saddam Hussein were to work out some face-saving way to withdraw from Kuwait, he would still be there with a very large army, still presumably intimidating to his neighbors, having invaded once. Given all that, do you think it is possible for this crisis ultimately to be resolved without removing Saddam Hussein from power, and if so, how?
All I want to do is see it resolved the way that the world opinion wants it resolved, and then we will worry about the rest of that later on. But the main thing is to have the withdrawal and the restoration of the rulers to their responsibilities. And so it's too hypothetical for me to go into what happens beyond that. But yes, I'd like to feel that can still happen. And the economic sanctions are just beginning to, Marlon says pinch, I'd say bite. And I think that they're going to be quite effective, more so than in the past. I certainly hope so. So let's just see how all that works.
On August 18th, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 664, demanding that Iraq allow all foreigners to leave Iraq and Kuwait, to which Saddam offered to release its hostages if the U.S. pulled out of Saudi Arabia. Secretary General Cuellar visited Baghdad the day before, attempting to get Saddam to release UN staff as well as other third-party civilians not involved in this conflict prior to the resolution's passage, warning of dire consequences if Iraq doesn't begin complying with them. President Bush hesitated in issuing an ultimatum to Iraq to release the hostages, fearing this could cause a premature clash before coalition forces were prepared. Despite this, other famous individuals, celebrities, and politicians would visit Baghdad, receive a lavish welcome and photo op with Saddam, and then come home with a dozen or so hostages. 5 tankers from Iraq were headed out of the Gulf, and the administration members, as well as foreign coalition leaders, were in disagreement over how the U.S. could unilaterally enforce the sanctions. President Bush, Secretary Cheney, and Deputy National Security Advisor Robert Gates, along with Margaret Thatcher, encouraged unilateral action. But the French, Canadians, and Soviets believed the U.S. required a separate UN resolution authorizing enforcement due to the original resolution being too vague. Secretary Baker also encouraged the administration to seek another UN resolution, not because he believed it was legally necessary, but because it was politically necessary to keep the Soviets and French in the coalition, both of whom had permanent seats on the Security Council and were thus vital in keeping up the international pressure on Saddam. The tankers would reach Yemen before the coalition could decide on enforcement. 2 of the empty tankers began sailing back to Iraq, and Central Command was uncertain of how to respond and decided to take a cautious interpretation of the UN resolution, allowing the empty ships to continue. The administration back in Washington called Schwarzkopf to complain about the decision and told him to stop the next ship that came through. The next day, a fully loaded tanker was headed out of the Gulf, and the USS Reed would fire several warning shots, but it refused to stop. Central Command then received additional instructions telling them not to sink any ship without White House approval, and after that to give the ship's crew a chance to evacuate before sinking it. This was creating a diplomatic crisis in the White House, with the Soviets threatening to withdraw their support from the coalition if the U.S. continued to act unilaterally. President Bush would tell Gorbachev that they would hold off on enforcement of the sanctions, but that they expected them to vote in support of them in the Security Council. The next morning, Colin Powell would give Central Command new instructions to just track Iraqi ships until a UN resolution authorizing enforcement was passed. We were off the hook until daybreak, having been treated to a classic illustration of what happens when Washington tries to direct combat operations from afar. Under most circumstances, being micromanaged would have made me furious, but in this case, I didn't mind. In September, James Baker began his Tin Cup tour traveling around Europe and the Middle East, looking for coalition partners to financially contribute to the Desert Shield, especially from those not sending troops or ships. Baker would also help Hosni Mubarak by getting Congress to write off some of Egypt's debts, due to the reduction in travel through the Suez during the crisis. Secretary General Cuellar also visits Baghdad again, pleading with Tariq Aziz to give some kind of sign that the occupation and annexation of Kuwait was not irreversible. To which Aziz claimed that Iraq had not started these hostilities and that he would only accept an Arab solution. The British would also use their diplomatic resources to support the coalition, such as when Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd visited the Gulf in September, meeting with the Sheikh of the UAE, the Sultan of Oman, and even King Hussein, who was trying to split the difference between Saddam and the coalition by opposing military intervention while also opposing the annexation of Kuwait. On September 6th, Parliament voted 437 to 35 to support Thatcher's policy on the crisis, which became even more certain of the necessity for military force, which began arriving in Saudi Arabia. The Gulf crisis was the most unified and coherent the United Nations had ever been. Even the Korean War wasn't as unifying, due to the USSR boycotting its decision rather than using its prerogative to veto the resolution approving the intervention. Other than that, the last time the US and Soviet Union were in unison on an international conflict was the Suez Crisis, when President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev jointly told the Israelis, French, and British to pull out of the Sinai. It's the cooperation of the Soviet Union with the US and the Security Council that has made these efforts possible so far. But getting Gorbachev and Shevardnadze to go along with anything was like pulling teeth for the Bush administration. And this was a consequence of the relationship between Iraq and the Soviet Union. The USSR had provided Iraq with its first nuclear reactor in the 1950s and supported the coup in 1958. Even after the 1968 coup brought the Baathists to power, they were quick to ally with Saddam, who condemned the party's anti-communist purge of 1963. He even gave Soviet officials a warning about the rightward shift in Arab politics in the early 70s, noting Anwar Sadat's more open embrace of Islam than Nasser had. This relationship became more hopeful in the mid-70s when the Baathists nationalized the Iraqi Petroleum Company and signed an accord with Comecon in 1975. But this high point was followed by a series of purges in the late 70s under the guise of rooting out foreign spies and traitors, largely targeting Shia Muslims. Despite this, the Soviets continued arming the Iraqis, only briefly halting arms sales after the start of the Iran-Iraq War, which Saddam had told the Soviets wasn't going to happen. Although it never said so publicly, Moscow strongly disapproved of the Iraqi invasion of Iran, but not because the attack was unexpected, as the Soviets had indeed considered an invasion to be an imminent possibility. Rather, Iraq's unwillingness to consult the Kremlin was seen as an attempt by Saddam to drag the Soviet Union into his military adventure, on the assumption that Moscow would automatically support whatever he did. It was this long relationship with Saddam, along with the Soviet Union's shrinking influence, that made them hesitant to throw their last Middle Eastern client under the bus. And this would be the background of the 1990 Helsinki summit between President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. Bush came to Helsinki in order to reaffirm Gorbachev's support for the campaign against Iraq, while Gorbachev wanted to find a resolution that would allow Saddam to save face, suggesting that Saddam's withdrawal from Kuwait should be followed by an international conference to resolve all other outstanding issues in the region. President Bush strongly rejected this proposal, believing it would give Saddam the credit for trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, thus rewarding him for unjustified aggression and making him a hero of the Arab and Islamic worlds. Bush tried to assuage Gorbachev's fears by offering Soviet troops a spot on the ground in Desert Shield, and assured him that the U.S. had no plans to keep a large force in the Gulf afterwards. Gorbachev countered, claiming that the U.S. had already succeeded in deterring further aggression from Saddam, and now just needed to find a way to peacefully remove Iraqi troops from Kuwait, and that letting Saddam save face was the best way to do so, believing Saddam would reject any offer short of that. But again, Bush rejected any option that he believed would empower Saddam. However, Gorbachev insisted that they could convince Saddam to withdraw willingly. This was not the first time they had promised this. Back in August, Shevardnadze had made the same promise to Secretary Baker, but it failed to materialize. But this time, Gorbachev was sending a member of his presidential council, Yevgeny Primakov. Primakov had been a correspondent for Pravda and Soviet radio during the 50s and 60s, and first met Saddam in Egypt while he was in exile. Based on his personal relationship with the Iraqi leader, Primakov believed that Saddam thought he was too valuable to the U.S. for him to be ousted, and thus took the risk of invading Kuwait. Primakov was also under the impression that Saddam, at some point, was a CIA asset. Now, there's no evidence of this whatsoever, but this is par for the course for the Soviets, for whom most left-wing conspiracy theories can be traced back to. One important piece of information the Soviets did provide about Saddam, though, was that he seemed to not understand the geopolitical situation he was in. He was under the impression that most of the world supported him, and both Gorbachev and Primakov believed Saddam's ministers and advisors were keeping him in the dark in order to appease his ego. The Iraqi leadership was behind the times internationally. They clung to the idea, which had taken root in the confrontational era, that in the event of a crisis in this part of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union would inevitably wind up on opposite sides of the barricades. In his memoirs, Gorbachev recounts a conversation he had with Tariq Aziz just a few days before the Helsinki summit. And in this interaction, he appears to give the Iraqis every chance possible to avoid conflict and resolve the situation peacefully. For us, the purpose of this conversation is to see whether the Iraqi leadership has any new ideas that might facilitate a political settlement. This is why we wanted you to come here on the eve of the meeting with Bush. We have collaborated with you in the past and would like to continue this collaboration. We have been searching for years for the key to the most important problems of the Middle East, especially the Palestinian problem, the Arab-Israeli conflict as a whole, and the Lebanese crisis. Now, after what Iraq has done, the task has become complicated many times over. It is unrealistic after all that has happened to talk about negotiations without displaying a readiness to withdraw Iraqi troops from Kuwait. After Bush and Gorbachev's one-on-one discussions, James Baker and Eduard Shevardnadze presented them with a joint statement to sign, and although it didn't mention an international conference to follow, it did say that they would work together to resolve other issues in the region, which was good enough for both leaders to sign. After the summit, Baker would travel to Moscow, where Gorbachev and Shevardnadze requested Baker ask the Saudis for a $4 billion loan in order to shore up the free-falling Soviet economy, which Baker agreed to, as well as giving reassurances to the Soviets that the U.S. would lay some groundwork for a Middle East peace conference after the crisis. When President Bush returned to Washington, he began using his popular support to pressure Congress into supporting his actions in the Gulf with an official vote.
So tonight, I want to talk to you about what's at stake, what we must do together to defend civilized values around the world and maintain our economic strength at home. Our objectives in the Persian Gulf are clear, our goals defined and familiar. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition. Kuwait's legitimate government must be restored. The security and stability of the Persian Gulf must be assured, and American citizens abroad must be protected. These goals are not ours alone. They've been endorsed by the United Nations Security Council 5 times in as many weeks. Most countries share our concern for principle, and many have a stake in the stability of the Persian Gulf. This is not, as Saddam Hussein would have it, the United States against Iraq. It is Iraq against the world.
And the next day, he would broadcast a message intended for the Iraqi people.
I'm here today to explain to the people of Iraq why the United States and the world community has responded the way it has to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. My purpose is not to trade accusations, not to escalate the war of words, but to speak with candor about what has caused this crisis that confronts us. Let there be no misunderstanding. We have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. I've said many times, and I will repeat right now, Our only object is to oppose the invasion ordered by Saddam Hussein. On August 2nd, your leadership made its decision to invade, an unprovoked attack on a small nation that posed no threat to your own. Kuwait was the victim, Iraq the aggressor, and the world met Iraq's invasion with a chorus of condemnation, unanimous resolutions in the United Nations. 27 states, rich and poor, Arab, Muslim, Asian, and African, have answered the call of Saudi Arabia and free Kuwait, and sent forces to the Gulf region to defend against Iraq. I do not believe that you, the people of Iraq, want war. No one knows better than you the incalculable costs of war, the ultimate costs when a nation's vast potential and vital energies are consumed by conflict. No one knows what Iraq might be today, what prosperity and peace you might now enjoy had your leaders not plunged you into war. Now, once again, Iraq finds itself on the brink of war. Once again, the same Iraqi leadership is miscalculated. Once again, the Iraqi people face tragedy. Saddam Hussein has told you that Iraqi troops were invited into Kuwait. That's not true. In fact, in the face of far superior force, the people of Kuwait are bravely resisting this occupation. Your own returning soldiers will tell you the Kuwaitis are fighting valiantly in any way they can. Saddam Hussein tells you that this crisis is a struggle between Iraq and America. In fact, it is Iraq against the world.
Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Sign up using my link in the description or in the pinned comment below to get a massive bonus pack for new and returning players, including multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 silver, and 7 days of premium account time.